Okay, I think one more minute. Welcome to Landlord Self-Help Center's Landlord Education Series. I would like to introduce my colleague and myself, Silvana Agostino, Alda Pereira, Carolina Rego, and myself, Diana Padierna. We're community legal workers at the Landlord Self-Help Center and will be providing today's presentation, which will address the topic of the Standard Form of Lease. This presentation offers general information only, not legal advice. Please be aware that we will be recording this presentation, so click on Got It in the pop-up window. There will also be a question period at the end of the presentation. We will be answering the questions previously received, so thank you very much for sending them to our email address. Also, please keep yourselves muted during this presentation. In Ontario, the Residential Tenancies Act is the provincial law that governs most residential rental agreements. It defines the rights and responsibilities of both landlords and tenants and outlines the rules pertaining to filling out the standard form of lease, and it defines which terms and conditions can be included in it. It is very important to remember that the Residential Tenancies Act stipulates which terms can be enforced, and that any terms included in the lease agreement that contravene the Residential Tenancies Act will not be enforced. With the introduction of Bill 124, the Rental Fairness Act 2017 on May 30th, 2017, landlords are required to use a standard lease for specified types of residential tenancies in Ontario. Starting April 30th, 2018, landlords entering into a written agreement must use the standard form of lease, which was developed by the Ministry of Housing. Thank you. And I will now pass it on to my colleague Carolina so she can expand on the standard form of lease.
Thank you, Diana. This new lease was released on February 7, 2018, and it is written in plain language to make it easier for landlords and tenants to understand the rights and responsibilities they have under the Residential Tenancies Act. Its aim is to work to eliminate the existence of terms and conditions that may be illegal, unenforceable, and not in compliance with the current law. A guide is available in multiple languages to help landlords and tenants understand and complete the standard form of lease. This is a snapshot of the beginning of the standard form of lease. It's available in two formats. The information can either be typed onto the agreement online and then printed, or it can be printed and filled out by hand. Make sure to keep all the pages together. A portion of the lease document is an appendix with additional information for all parties. Make sure to read through this document carefully before signing it. The Ontario Residential Tenancy Agreement, or Standard Form of Lease, has undergone some amendments, and the new updated form must be used beginning March 1st, 2021. The amendments were needed to reflect the changes made by Bill 184, the Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act 2020, and Bill 204, the Helping Tenants and Small Businesses Act 2020. Effective July 21st, 2020, as long as landlords have used the Ontario Standard Form of Lease, they are no longer required to provide the tenant information package. The Residential Tenancies Act does not require landlords in Ontario to have a written tenancy agreement. However, Ontario landlords entering into a written residential tenancy agreement on or after April 30th of 2018 are required to use the Ontario Standard Form of Lease, which was developed by the Ministry of Housing. An updated standard form lease has to be used for new agreements signed on or after March 1st, 2021. The forms are available on the Ontario government website and through the Landlord Self-Help Center's website. Multi-language guides are also available and provide more information about the standard form of lease and include examples of illegal clauses as well as legal clauses which may be used in the additional terms section. If a tenancy agreement was signed before April 30th of 2018, the tenant is not required to have a standard form of lease. However, if both parties agree and the new terms are negotiated on or after April 30th, 2018, a standard form lease can be entered into. You should contact a legal representative or landlord self-help center if you are unsure which terms are allowed to be renegotiated under the current law. Tenancy agreements can be structured to run on a periodic or fixed term. An example of a periodic agreement would be a monthly tenancy, while an example of a fixed term agreement would be a one-year tenancy. It's important for landlords to know that the end of a lease does not mean the tenant has to move out. Leases are renewed automatically at the same frequency, whether it's a daily, weekly, or monthly lease. When it comes time to the end of the term, if the parties agree, a new written lease can be entered into, or the tenancy will continue under the same terms and conditions and become a month-to-month tenancy. The landlord, however, can still increase the rent each year by the amount allowed under the Act, as long as proper notice is given. Thank you. Now I'll pass it over to Alda to discuss why written agreements are important.
Thank you, Carolina. Why written tenancy agreements are important. If a dispute arises, a written agreement may help to resolve the issues. Landlords are strongly encouraged to document the terms of the tenancy by way of a written agreement signed by the landlord and the tenant before the tenancy begins. Written tenancy agreements are important as they work to clearly define the terms and conditions of the tenancy. Written tenancy agreements are a way to document things such as who the parties are, landlord and tenant, the address of the rental unit, the rent amount and when it is due, and what is included or not included with the rental unit. For example, parking, laundry facilities, or utilities. Landlords are strongly encouraged to document the terms of the tenancy by way of a written agreement signed by the landlord and tenant before the tenancy begins. As previously discussed, having a written agreement in place allows landlords and tenants to provide consent to allow for service of documents by email, defines rent discounts, requires the tenant to get contents and liability insurance, makes note of the last month's rent and key deposits, outlines smoking rules, and provides information about maintenance and repairs in the rental unit. The standard form of lease applies to the following rental units: single and semi-detached houses, apartment buildings, secondary units, for example, basement apartments, and condominiums. Request for standard lease by tenant. If the standard form of lease is provided to the tenant within 21 days of the written request, the tenant can decide whether or not they agree with the terms. If the tenant does not agree with the terms, they can then give the landlord 60 days notice to end their tenancy early. However, this notice cannot be given later than 30 days after the landlord provided a copy of the standard lease. The end date or termination date on the notice must be the end of the rental period. Thank you. I will now pass it on to Silvana.
Thank you, Alda. Okay, now I will discuss adding additional terms to the standard lease. Having a standard lease form does not mean that you are not allowed to include terms specific to your rental unit. However, these specific terms cannot contravene the RTA, as any terms that do so will be void and unenforceable. The additional terms should be attached to the lease, must be in plain language, and can be related to a specific common space or amenity unique to your rental unit. The following are examples of additional terms that can be enforced. The landlord reserves the right to enter the rental unit with proper notice or any other reason not specified under the RTA. The tenant is required to provide the landlord with a written notification of any maintenance issues. The tenant agrees to use the rental unit for residential occupancy only, and that they will not rent the unit through short-term rental or on sites such as Airbnb. Other examples are the tenant agrees to obtain their own contents assurance. The tenant agrees that the landlord can take photos of the rental unit during an inspection or to advertise the unit for rent or sale after providing proper notice. The tenant is not allowed to do any repairs without the landlord's written consent. The tenant must inform the landlord in writing of any damages to the rental unit. Subletting is only allowed with written consent by the landlord, and a copy of the sublet agreement must be provided to the landlord. For more additional terms, please visit the members area of our website. The following are some examples of terms that contravene the RTA and therefore cannot be enforced even if they are included in your lease. Clauses that do not allow pets, do not allow guests, roommates, or additional occupants, require the tenant to pay deposits, fees, or penalties that are not permitted under the Act. Example, damage or pet deposit or interest on rent arrears, and require the tenant to pay for all or part of the repairs that are the responsibility of the landlord. The signature part. Once you have prepared your lease, you need to ensure that all landlords and tenants listed as parties sign the lease. The lease can be signed electronically if all parties agree. Make sure that the tenant signs it first and prior to moving into the rental unit. The landlord must give a copy of the agreement at least within 21 days after the tenant signs it, or the tenant can withhold rent until a copy of the lease is provided. Now I will pass it back to Diana. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvana. It's very important to educate yourself and gather information about various topics related to renting. Use resources found on the Ontario government and Landlord Self-Help Centers websites to help guide you. The Ontario government website contains both the old and the new versions of the Standard Form of Lease required for landlords to use. It also has a link to a guide which provides instructions on how to fill out the lease. Thank you so much for your attention. We will now address your questions. Please remember that we are answering questions previously received, so thank you so much for sending them to our email address. If you were not able to send in a question and you would like to ask a question today, please call our office during our regular business hours and we'll be happy to assist you. The first question that we received says, I signed a one-year lease on May 1st, 2021 with my tenant, but we did not use a standard lease form. Does this mean that my one-year lease is void? Silvana, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure, Diana. No, your lease is still valid. However, if the tenant asks for the standard form of lease, you are legally obligated to provide it to the tenant within 21 days of their request, or they can withhold the rent.
Thank you, Silvana. The next question says, I am filling out the standard form of lease, but I am wondering if it has to be for a fixed term period, such as 1 year. Alda, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure. No, the standard form of lease can be filled out for a fixed term or as a monthly tenancy.
Thank you, Alda. The next question says, my tenant and I signed the standard form of lease for 1 year, ending on March 31st, 2022. They have now given me notice that they are ending the lease early. What can I do? Carolina, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure. So the tenant is required to provide you with at least 60 days notice, and they should do this using Form N9. Sometimes they don't. So as the landlord, the Residential Tenancies Act requires that you mitigate your losses, which means you need to advertise the rental unit and document all of your efforts to find another tenant. Once the tenant has vacated and you've re-rented the unit, you may be able to sue the former tenant for the expenses that you incurred through the landlord and tenant board. The next question says, my tenancy started in 2010 and is now a monthly tenancy. My tenant is now demanding a standard form of lease. Do I have to provide them with one? Diana, would you like to take this one?
Sure. Since the tenancy started before the standard form of lease came into effect, you are not legally required to provide one to your tenant. However, if you and the tenant are going to sign a new lease to extend their current tenancy, this must be done using the standard form of lease. The next question says, I have a clause in my lease that states that the tenant cannot have any other occupants in the rental unit. I just found out that my tenant has 2 other people living with him and that he is charging them rent. Is he allowed to do this? Silvana, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure. This term in your lease is void and unenforceable. The tenant is allowed to have roommates and even collect rent from them as long as they are not charging the roommates more than the rent that they are actually paying you.
Thank you, Silvana. The next question says, I have a 3-year lease with my tenant, which expires a year from now. The lease includes a clause stating that the lease can be terminated early if the landlord requires the unit back for personal use by giving 60 days notice. Am I able to terminate the lease earlier because of this clause? Alda, would you like to answer that, please?
Okay. No, this is another example of an unenforceable term. Despite the fact that this clause is in the lease, you would not be able to terminate the lease earlier for personal use. When there's a fixed term lease in place, the landlord can only terminate the tenancy for the landlord's personal use at the end of the lease term with the proper legal notice of termination.
Thank you, Alda. The next question says, I have sold my rental property and the purchaser plans to move in. However, I have a lease with my tenant and there are still a few months left in the lease. Can I still give notice to the tenant for the purchaser to move in? Carolina, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure, Diana. No, in this case, you cannot give notice to terminate for the purchaser to move in while the lease is still in effect. The purchaser would have to take over the property, assume the tenant, and then they can only give notice for their own use closer to the end of the lease term. The next question says, I'm renting my house for the first time, and I just found out that I have to use a standard lease form. I have reviewed it, but there are certain terms that I would like to include that are not in this lease. How would I be able to do this? Diana, can you please answer this?
Sure. So landlords can add clauses in Section 15 of the Standard Form of Lease to include certain provisions and responsibilities pertaining to the tenancy agreement or the rental property. The additional terms will still have to be consistent with the law, otherwise they may not be enforceable. The next question says, I signed a 1-year lease with my tenants, and my lease clearly states that they cannot have pets in the rental unit. I recently inspected the unit and realized that they have 2 cats. Can I evict my tenants for not following my lease? Silvana, would you like to answer that, please?
Sure. This is another example of a term that is not legal. According to the RTA, tenants are allowed to have pets unless other tenants have an allergic reaction to the pet or the pet is causing a disturbance. For example, by the pet constantly barking.
Thank you, Silvana. The last question says, I am aware that the standard form of lease includes an appendix. Do I need to provide the entire document to the tenant, or can I just give them the lease agreement part? Alda, would you like to answer that, please?
Okay. The appendix contains useful information for both the landlords and the tenants about their rights and responsibilities. So it is strongly encouraged to provide the tenant with the entire document.
Thank you so much, Alda. And that's it for the question period. On behalf of the Landlord Self-Help Center, thank you so much for attending this presentation about the standard form of lease. We would like to remind you to please fill out our satisfaction survey based on this presentation, and we look forward to see you in our upcoming presentations. Bye, everyone.